Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. We are told that the age of resource wars is behind us, that this time it's different because the new economy runs on ideas, software, and clean energy, not on dirty commodities. Meanwhile, every electric car motor, every modern wind turbine, and a good part of NATO's missile stockpile quietly depend on a handful of metals that mostly come from one country and a few mines. The conflict is simple. Politicians promise green transition, digitalization, and military deterrence. The physical system that feeds all three is built on rare earth elements, and around 2/3 of their mining and close to 90% of their processing set in or under the control of China. For Europe and the US, that is the new oil dependency, just without the honesty of calling it that. And this is where the official story starts to fall apart. Rare earths are sold to the public as some exotic niche topic. They are not. They are the small, invisible parts that decide whether the big, visible systems work at all. If you strip away the marketing, the question is blunt. Who controls the bottlenecks that keep your cars moving, your grid stable, and your military supplied? Now, here's the part that keeps serious people awake at night. You can build solar panels and batteries almost anywhere. You cannot, on a realistic timescale, replace a concentrated global supply chain of rare earth mining, separation, metal making, and magnet production that has been built and subsidized for decades. Promises move fast. New mines do not. So, what are we actually talking about? Rare earth elements are a group of 17 metals. They are not really rare in the Earth's crust. The problem is that they rarely appear in high concentrations, and separating them is dirty, chemically intensive, and politically unpopular in rich countries. That is why the West quietly outsourced the mess years ago, then pretended it outsourced the risk as well. In practical terms, a typical electric car uses a few kilos of rare earth-based magnets in its motor. A large offshore wind turbine can need hundreds of kilos of these magnets in its generator. Modern fighter jets, precision-guided munitions, sonar systems, radar, smartphones, hard drives, MRIs, all of them consume different mixes of neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, terbium, and friends. If you work in manufacturing or energy, you've seen this movie before. You know how it ends when a single supplier dominates a critical input. In short, the physics is boring and ruthless. You either have secure access to these metals, or your plans are just PowerPoint slides. China understood this early. From the 1980s and 1990s, Beijing treated rare earths as a strategic industry. It tolerated environmental damage, underpriced competitors, and built capacity all along the chain: mines, separation plants, alloy producers, and magnet factories. Over time, this pushed most rival producers out of the market. Today, other countries mine some rare earths, but the majority of separation and processing still runs through Chinese facilities. The ore can be Australian, American, or African. The value added and the choke point often sit in China. This is the structural flaw you can't fix with a press release. If you take one thing from this video, let it be this. The new oil weapon does not look like tankers being turned around at sea. It looks like one government deciding that export licenses for magnet materials will take a little longer to approve this month, or that certain alloys will now require national security review, or that environmental standards will be updated, conveniently tightening supply just when Western demand surges. And there is one number in this whole story that almost nobody in Brussels or Washington likes to say out loud. We'll get to it. First, the West's part in this. For decades, Europe and the US enjoyed cheap, rare earths. Mines at home were shut or mothballed. Environmental standards improved domestically, while the dirty steps of the chain were quietly relocated to Inner Mongolia and a few other places. On paper, this was de-risking and efficiency. In practice, it was total dependency disguised as smart globalization. When China briefly restricted rare earth exports in 2010 after a diplomatic clash with Japan, prices spiked worldwide. That was the warning shot. Everyone solemnly promised to diversify supply. A few projects restarted. Some recycling pilots appeared. Then prices fell again, the urgency faded, and capital went back to easier, faster things. Promise versus physics, round one, lost on points. If you are watching this from Germany, France, or the Baltics, your reality today is simple. Your governments talk about strategic autonomy, sanctions, and de-risking from China. At the same time, every additional offshore wind farm, every EV subsidy program, every new defense procurement quietly increases your exposure to the Chinese rare earth system. The flag on the finished product may be European. The magnet in the heart of it is not. Here is where the story stops making sense. Now, let's add some scale. Globally, demand for rare earths used in magnets has been rising steadily and is expected to multiply in the coming decades as EVs and wind power expand. We do not need an exact forecast to see the direction up. Even conservative scenarios from mainstream agencies talk about several-fold growth in demand for key magnet metals by 2040. At the same time, opening a new mine and processing plant in a democratic country with strong environmental regulation can easily take 10 to 15 years from discovery to meaningful output. In short, the math doesn't care about our ambitions. The public rhetoric is full of independence from authoritarian regimes. The private reality is that Europe and the US have tied their green, digital, and military agendas to a supply chain where one authoritarian state holds most of the cards. This is the part no politician wants to explain on TV. How do you talk about values when the magnets inside your missiles and your wind turbines depend on permits granted in Beijing? So, let's take a breath. Where does this leave us so far? We have a global push for electrification, renewables, and rearmament. We have rare earth demand heading up. We have a supply chain dominated by one country that spent decades building an advantage while others outsourced and forgot. And we have Western elites who pretend this is fine because the stock market still likes the story. And this brings us to the number that changes the entire equation. For many critical rare earth products, Europe's import dependency is not 50% or 70%. It is well above 90%. In plain language, if those flows are disrupted, there is no quick local backup. You can't print a separation plant the way you print money. Now, here's the part that keeps defense planners uneasy, even if they don't say it in public. Modern militaries are rare earth junkies. Guidance systems, jet engines, sonar, communications, lasers, night vision, the list is long. If the same supply chain feeds both your civilian green transition and your weapons, then in a crisis you will face a brutal choice: power grids and cars or missiles and jets. That choice will not be made on Twitter. It will be made in procurement rooms and war cabinets. And if you are a small state on the periphery, like Lithuania or any Baltic country, you will simply live with whatever allocation the big players decide. You see the problem here, right? China, for its part, has learned from the oil producers' experience. The smart play is not to constantly threaten embargoes. The smart play is to remind the world that you could, and then watch investors and policymakers adjust their behavior accordingly. Beijing's message is quiet but clear. If you want a smooth energy transition and affordable defense hardware, you might want to think twice before trying to choke our semiconductor access, our shipping lanes, or our companies. Officially, this is all framed as normal trade. In practice, it behaves like a deterrence tool. On the Western side, you now see a rush of strategies and slogans. The EU has its Critical Raw Materials Act. Washington throws subsidies at mining and processing projects. There are glossy brochures about friendshoring, moving parts of the supply chain to allied countries like Australia, Canada, or perhaps some African partners. It all sounds dynamic. But when you read the fine print, timelines stretch into the 2030s, environmental approvals drag on, and local protests appear wherever a new mine is proposed. Everybody loves strategic autonomy until there is blasting and acid in their valley. This is the structural flaw you can't fix with a TED Talk. If you take one thing from this part of the story, let it be this. Every serious attempt to break rare earth dependency requires one of three uncomfortable things: more mining at home, more pollution somewhere, or less consumption of the products that use these metals. There is no magic fourth option that keeps lifestyles, margins, and moral comfort unchanged. The physics does not negotiate. Let's bring this down from geopolitics to your monthly bills. When magnet materials get more expensive or scarce, the cost of wind turbines and EV motors rises. It might be just a few percent on the hardware, but in highly leveraged projects with tight returns, that can be the difference between go and delay. Delays mean fewer turbines installed this year, fewer EVs delivered, and more years of paying for fossil-heavy grids and imported fuel. This is the moment a supply chain decision made 20 years ago shows up as a higher electricity bill in Vilnius, Berlin, or Barcelona. For small and medium manufacturers, the pain is even more direct. If you build motors, generators, robotics, specialized equipment, rare earth magnet prices are not an abstraction. They sit right in your material costs. A sudden spike can wipe out your margin for the year. You can try to pass it on to customers, but in a weak economy, that simply kills demand. And then, of course, someone in a capital city will tell you that we must de-risk from China, after building a system where de-risking you means re-risking your balance sheet. Here is where the theory meets a brick wall. So what do the players actually want? China wants to keep and monetize its position without triggering a full coordinated backlash. That means gradual tightening, selective controls, and using legal tools like export licensing instead of dramatic embargoes. The US wants to rebuild domestic and allied capacity fast enough to reduce vulnerability, but not so fast that it offends every local community and environmental NGO. Europe wants to keep its climate targets, maintain moral superiority, avoid mines in its own backyard, and somehow magically diversify supply. Good luck synchronizing that triangle. If you're watching this from Germany, your reality is already different from someone in Portugal or Lithuania. Germany's industrial base is heavy on autos and machinery that depend on motors and high-performance magnets. The Baltics are smaller, more import-dependent, with less heavy industry, but fully exposed to whatever decisions are made upstream in Berlin, Brussels, and Beijing. In both cases, the end result is the same. You pay for decisions made far away from you, in rooms you will never enter. Now, here's the quiet part said out loud. Rare earths are not just about extraction and processing. They are about standards and lock-in. Once your car platform, your turbine design, or your missile guidance system is optimized around a specific magnet or alloy, switching away is expensive and slow. That creates technological path dependence. The company that controls the magnet supply does not need to cut you off. It just needs to remind you that you could be cut off, and you will structure your politics accordingly. This is why I call it a new kind of resource war. Not a war of tanks around oil wells, but a slow, bureaucratic struggle for control over invisible components. Publicly, everyone still pretends we live in a world of ideas and shared values. Privately, the question is, whose export license decides whether your frigate sails next year, and whose environmental permit decides whether your wind farm is built on time? So, where does this leave ordinary people, beyond the jargon and the trade flows? You get to fund three things at once. First, you pay for massive investment into green and digital infrastructure that cannot be built without these metals. Second, you pay higher prices whenever the supply chain hiccups. Third, you pay for defense budgets that quietly depend on the same materials. Taxes, bills, and inflation carry the weight of a strategic failure that nobody voted for in any meaningful way. Does this look like a strategy from your corner of Europe, or just managed decline with good marketing? In countries like Lithuania, Latvia, or Estonia, the irony is sharper. We follow the line on sanctions, de-risking, and tough rhetoric. We have almost no leverage on the raw materials that keep the broader European project running. If the big players mishandle this, the periphery will not be asked for approval. It will be presented with the bill in higher energy costs, weaker industry, and fewer options. Now, here's the part that should bother serious policymakers but usually doesn't. Every euro or dollar spent scrambling for rare earth alternatives under time pressure is a euro not spent on real productivity, on better infrastructure, education, actual industry. Instead of long-term planning, we get emergency industrial policy, subsidies to whoever shouts critical minerals loudest, and another round of bubbles in mining stocks. The pattern is familiar. Ignore a risk, then overpay later in panic mode. So, let's take another breath. We started with a simple claim. Rare earths are the new oil war. The reality is more subtle and, in some ways, worse. We are not in an open war yet. We are in a slow squeeze, built on decades of complacency and short-term thinking. One side built capacity and accepted costs. The other side outsourced, moralized, and went to sleep. Now the bill is arriving in the form of dependency that touches everything from your car and your phone to your electricity and your security. And this is the real price tag of that convenient lie that this time it's different. This time it's about values, not resources. It is still about resources. The only difference is that the pipes are smaller, the metals are harder to pronounce, and the leverage is easier to deny in public. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones, and try to remember, slogans don't power grids, systems do.